I don't usually wake up at 4 in the morning. At least I didn't used to. But that night, my eyes were already open when the alarm clock glowed faintly on the dresser. 4:03. The numbers looked too sharp in the dark, like they didn't belong there, like someone had left a light on by mistake. I didn't feel startled, just aware. The house was quiet in a way that felt unfinished. Not the kind of quiet you look forward to after a long day. More like the kind where sound has nowhere to land, where even small noises feel exposed. I stayed still, listening. The refrigerator hummed somewhere down the hall. Pipes clicked softly, adjusting to the cold, the house settling into itself the way it always did at night. And then there was the breathing beside the bed. Not mine. Slow, uneven, a little louder than it needed to be, like the person, or thing, doing it wasn't quite aware of how quiet the room had become. I found myself counting without trying to. In, out, the pause between. At some point, I realized my hand was resting on the edge of the mattress, fingers curled slightly inward, as if I was bracing for something, or holding a place. I remember thinking that if the breathing stopped, I would know immediately. That thought arrived fully formed without panic. It didn't rush in, it just sat there. And what unsettled me wasn't the idea itself, it was how natural it felt. I lay there longer than I should have, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling fan, trying to remember when I'd last slept through the night without waking up inside my own head. Sleep used to be automatic. You closed your eyes and time did its thing. Lately it felt more like something I had to negotiate. Some nights I fell asleep quickly and woke up hours later with no clear reason. Other nights I stayed awake, not anxious exactly, just alert in a way that didn't seem useful. That night, though, I didn't feel restless. I felt present, which was new. The breathing beside me shifted, a soft exhale followed by the sound of something adjusting its weight. The mattress dipped slightly, just enough for me to feel it. I didn't move. There was a time when I would have reached out without thinking, placed a hand on a shoulder, let myself settle into another person's warmth. That reflex had gone quiet. Instead, I stayed where I was, listening, letting the moment exist without interfering with it. The strange thing was, I wasn't lonely right then. I didn't feel content either, just accompanied. That felt important, though I couldn't have said why. The house still felt too big for one person. The bed still felt wider than it needed to be. But there was something anchoring the moment, keeping it from drifting away completely. I glanced at the clock again. 4:17. Too early to get up. Too awake to sleep. I thought about getting a glass of water, but decided against it. The idea of turning on lights felt intrusive, like it would break something delicate. So I stayed. I listened to the breathing, to the hum of the house, to the sound of time passing in small, manageable pieces, and somewhere in the middle of that, in the space between one breath and the next, I realized how much effort it had taken lately to stay connected to anything at all, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would have worried anyone, just in the quiet, ordinary sense of needing a reason to stay present in the room you're already in. I didn't think about the past. I didn't think about the future. I just stayed there, awake at 4 in the morning, listening to something breathe beside me, aware of the simple fact that if I left the room it would notice. And for reasons I didn't yet understand, that mattered. After the divorce, people kept asking me what it felt like. Friends, coworkers, even people I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly checking in with careful voices, like they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. I never knew how to answer them. Not because it hurt too much, but because nothing felt dramatic. There was no explosion, no final argument that echoed in my head afterward. No moment I could point to and say, that's when everything broke. It was quieter than that. It felt more like watching the tide go out. At first, you don't notice it. The water's still there. The shoreline looks mostly the same. But then you realize you're walking farther than you used to just to reach it. The house didn't feel empty right away. That's the strange part. It felt quieter. Not peaceful quiet. Just the kind of quiet where sound has nowhere to land. I'd come home from work and stand in the doorway longer than necessary, keys still in my hand, as if the house needed a moment to recognize me. Some rooms I stopped going into altogether, Not consciously, I didn't decide to avoid them, I just didn't have a reason anymore. The guest room slowly turned into a place for things I didn't know what to do with. Boxes, old papers, objects that once had a function, now waiting for one. The dining table stopped being a table, it became a surface. Mail stacked neatly at first, then less neatly. Envelopes I didn't open right away because nothing inside felt urgent enough to interrupt the quiet. I started eating standing up. Not because I was busy, because sitting down felt like a commitment I didn't know how to make. I'd lean against the counter, take a few bites, and tell myself I'd clean up later. Later became tomorrow. Tomorrow became next week. Weekdays were manageable. They had shape, an alarm, a shower. The same roads, the same lights, the same conversations that didn't require much from me. Weekends were harder. Weekends were just long stretches of unstructured time that I had to survive. I slept more, but never felt rested. I stayed up later, but never felt engaged. Sometimes I'd turn on the television and realize an hour had passed without me absorbing a single word. The sound filled the space, but it didn't reach me. I wasn't sad all the time. That would have been easier to explain. Sadness has a language people recognize. They know what to do with it. What I felt was flatter than that. Neutral. And that neutrality scared me more than grief ever had, because it felt permanent. I still functioned. I went to work. I answered emails. I showed up when I was supposed to. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. But inside, things had started to thin out. Like someone had slowly lowered the volume on my life without telling me. Time began behaving differently. Evenings stretched, but days disappeared. I'd look at the calendar and realize a week had passed without anything marking it. No memory sharp enough to separate one day from the next. I stopped cooking real meals. I stopped listening to music. Music had a way of making me feel things I didn't want to unpack yet. Silence was easier. There were moments, small ones, where I'd notice something was missing, and my body would react before my mind caught up. Reaching for a second coffee mug, pausing mid-sentence, realizing there was no one to finish it for, turning my head when I heard a noise that wasn't there. Those moments passed quickly. I learned not to linger on them. I told myself this was just adjustment, that this was normal, that everyone goes through this and comes out the other side. But late at night, when the house had settled and even the street outside went quiet, I'd lie awake and feel something uncomfortable pressing against my chest. Not panic, just a dull awareness. The sense that if I stayed like this long enough, I might disappear inside my own routines. That scared me more than being alone. I didn't miss my old life the way people expected me to. I didn't replay memories or wish for things to go back. What I missed was presence. The feeling that my days were being witnessed by something other than myself, that my existence had weight because it affected another living thing. I didn't say that out loud to anyone. It sounded dramatic, even to me. So I kept going. I told myself I was fine. I told myself I liked the quiet. I told myself this was just what adulthood looked like once you stripped away the noise. But some nights, standing in the kitchen with the lights off, I'd catch my reflection in the dark window and barely recognize the person looking back. Not because I looked different, because I looked paused, like someone waiting for instructions that weren't coming. That's when the idea first surfaced. Not loudly, not as a solution, more like a thought that drifted through and refused to leave. Maybe I needed something to take care of, not a project, not a distraction, something that required me to show up consistently, even when I didn't feel like myself. The thought felt almost selfish. I dismissed it at first. I told myself I wasn't in the right place, that I didn't have the energy, that it wouldn't be fair. But the idea stayed. And the longer the house stayed quiet, the more it began to feel less like an idea and more like a question. I didn't go looking for a dog. That's the part people usually get wrong when I tell this story later. They assume there was a moment where I decided something needed to change. That I woke up one day and thought, I need companionship, or I need a reason to get out of bed. It wasn't like that. The idea had been hovering in the background for a while, but quietly, more like static than a plan, something I noticed only when everything else went silent. A coworker mentioned the shelter one afternoon. We were standing near the coffee machine, talking about nothing important. Weather, deadlines, the usual things people say when they don't want to go straight back to their desks. She said they were full, especially older dogs. She said it casually, like it was just information. I nodded, took my coffee, and went back to work, but the sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. That weekend, I went. I told myself I was just curious, that I wanted to look, that I wasn't committing to anything. The parking lot was half full when I pulled in. I sat in the car for a minute longer than necessary, hands still on the steering wheel, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Inside, it smelled like disinfectant and something warmer underneath. Not unpleasant, just unmistakable. The younger dogs made themselves known immediately, barking, jumping, pressing against the bars like they had something urgent to prove. I walked past them slowly. Then I saw him. He wasn't doing much of anything, just standing there, a little stiff, watching me approach. His face had gone gray in places where it used to be darker, one eye cloudier than the other, unfocused like it wasn't quite keeping up anymore. The volunteer told me his age. She said it gently, the way people do when they're not sure how the number will land. She mentioned his health issues, minor things, manageable things, the kind of things that add up. He's calm, she said, mostly keeps to himself. That sounded familiar. I didn't feel a rush, no spark, no moment of recognition. What I felt was practicality. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't fragile in a way that scared me. He looked like he knew how to exist quietly. I told myself I could handle that. The paperwork took longer than I expected. Signatures, questions, warnings, they made sure I understood what I was agreeing to. I nodded a lot. When we walked out together, he hesitated at the door. Just for a second, then followed. The first night was awkward. He didn't know the house. I didn't know him. He stood in the middle of the living room, uncertain, while I hovered nearby, unsure of where I was supposed to be in relation to him. I showed him the water bowl, the food, the bed I'd bought last minute, still smelling like plastic and cardboard. He sniffed everything carefully, like he was cataloging it for later. That night, I slept lightly. Every sound pulled me halfway awake. A shift of weight, a quiet exhale, the soft click of nails against the floor. I told myself it was temporary. The next few days settled into something resembling routine, but it didn't feel natural yet. He woke up early, earlier than I liked. I walked him even when I didn't feel like leaving the house, even when the weather didn't cooperate, even when I would have preferred to stay in and let the day pass without noticing me. He didn't pull, he didn't rush. We moved at the same pace. I didn't think much of it at first. Feeding him became a fixed point in the day, morning, evening, the same sounds, the same small rituals. I started timing my days around those moments without really noticing. There wasn't a sudden emotional shift, no realization where I stopped and thought, this matters. It was subtler than that. I found myself coming home at a certain hour without checking the time. I noticed the weather again, not because it affected me, because it affected him. We sat together sometimes, not touching, just occupying the same space. He slept more than I expected, curled up in places that caught the light just right, near the window, by the door. I learned his sounds, which ones meant discomfort, which ones meant nothing at all. He learned mine. Somewhere along the way, the house changed. Not dramatically. It didn't feel full. It felt used again. Doors opened and closed more often. Lights stayed on longer. The silence wasn't as absolute. I didn't talk to him much, not in full sentences, just small acknowledgments, habit more than intention. I still told myself I was doing this for him, that I was giving him a quiet place to land. It didn't occur to me yet that I was doing the same thing. At some point, without me noticing exactly when it happened, taking care of him stopped feeling like a task and started feeling like structure. Not purpose, not meaning, just structure. My days began to bend around his needs in small, unremarkable ways. I woke up earlier because he did. I went outside even when I didn't feel like it because he had to. I noticed the time not by clocks anymore, but by habits, morning walks, evening meals, the quiet pause before bed. None of it felt profound while it was happening. It felt logistical, manageable, almost dull, but the days stopped dissolving into each other. I knew what day it was because I knew what we had already done together. The walks were slow, slower than I was used to. He stopped often, sometimes to sniff things that looked meaningless to me, sometimes just to stand there and take in whatever information his body was still able to gather. At first, I felt impatient. I told myself I was just adjusting. Eventually, I matched his pace without thinking about it. We started taking the same route every morning, down the street past the houses with the trimmed hedges, toward the small patch of grass that caught the sun first. People nodded as we passed. Some said hello, some didn't. I didn't mind either way. Being seen briefly without explanation felt easier than conversation. Inside the house, he followed me less than I expected. He didn't need to be in the same room all the time. Just nearby, close enough that I could hear him shift positions. Close enough that silence didn't feel empty. He chose his places carefully, the spot near the window in the afternoon, the corner of the living room in the evening, the space beside the bed at night. I began to anticipate where he would be before I saw him there. I learned the difference between his sleeping sounds and his uncomfortable ones. The small sigh he made before settling, the quiet huff when he needed something but didn't want to demand it. He learned mine too, the way I moved when I was distracted, the way my breathing changed when I stayed up too late, the sound of my footsteps when I was about to leave the house. There were days when I realized I hadn't thought about myself at all. Not in a dramatic, selfless way, just in the sense that my attention had somewhere else to rest. I still had bad days. Days where everything felt heavy again. Days where I moved through the hours on autopilot. But even then, there were interruptions. A leash hanging by the door, a bowl that needed filling, a body that depended on mine to keep the day moving forward. I told myself I was doing this for him, that he needed consistency, that his age made routine important. That sounded reasonable. What I didn't say out loud was how much I needed it too. There were moments, small, quiet ones, where I noticed something unsettling. If I came home later than usual, he waited near the door. Not anxiously, just present. If I sat down without energy, he adjusted himself closer without touching me. If I stayed up too late, he didn't settle until I did. These weren't gestures, they weren't messages, they were patterns, and patterns have weight. The house continued to change. Not in ways you could photograph, in ways you could feel. Lights stayed on longer in the evenings. Windows were opened more often. I noticed dust again. Not because it bothered me, because it meant the place was being lived in. I started cooking more. Simple things, nothing elaborate. Food tasted different when I ate it sitting down. Music came back slowly, low volume. Songs I already knew, so they didn't ask anything of me. He slept through most of it. Some nights I caught myself talking out loud. Not to him exactly, just in his presence, narrating small decisions, commenting on nothing important. The sound of my own voice stopped feeling intrusive. I realized gradually that my absence mattered now. Not in a dramatic sense, not in a way that made me feel essential. Just enough that leaving required thought. Just enough that staying felt intentional. I still believed I was the caretaker, that he was the fragile one. That time was the thing we were managing. It hadn't occurred to me yet that we were holding each other in place, that the routines weren't just keeping him stable, they were keeping me anchored, that I wasn't just giving him a reason to wake up, I was giving myself one too, and I didn't question it. Not yet. The first time the vet mentioned it, I didn't hear the word clearly. Not because she didn't say it, because my mind refused to hold on to it. We were sitting in a small room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and something warmer underneath. The kind of room designed to feel neutral, as if neutrality could soften what usually happened there. She talked calmly, professionally. She pointed at numbers on a chart, explained changes that came with age, spoke about comfort and quality of life. I nodded, asked practical questions, took notes I didn't look at again. Then she paused. just long enough for the room to change shape. She said there were options. She said we didn't need to decide anything right away. She asked how I was feeling about it. That's when I realized she wasn't talking about medicine anymore. The word landed properly that time. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just there. Ready. I said I needed time. She nodded like she'd expected that answer. On the drive home, he slept in the passenger seat, his body rising and falling in a rhythm I knew by heart. The city moved past us like it always did. Traffic lights, familiar turns, the same roads we'd taken dozens of times before. Nothing looked different, but everything felt thinner. At home, he went straight to his usual spot by the window and curled up like he always did. The afternoon light caught the gray in his fur, made it stand out more than usual. I stood there longer than necessary, watching him breathe. I told myself this wasn't urgent, that we had time, but time had already shifted. The days after that appointment felt heavier, even when nothing happened. Especially when nothing happened. I started watching him too closely, counting breaths, noticing pauses that had probably always been there, questioning every small change. At night, I lay awake listening to him, the way I had the first night he came home. Only now, the awareness had teeth. I started asking myself questions I didn't have language for. Was I being responsible or afraid? Was I protecting him or protecting myself from what the house would feel like without him? Those questions didn't come with answers. Just wait. The second appointment came sooner than I expected. She spoke gently again. Explained the same things, just more clearly this time. She didn't push. She didn't rush. She said, "You'll know when it's time." I hated that sentence. Not because it was unkind, but because it handed the responsibility back to me. At home, the routines continued. Morning walks, meals. The quiet pause before bed. Everything looked the same. That was the hardest part. There was no clear line where things became unbearable. No signal that made the decision obvious. Just a slow accumulation. One night, he struggled to get comfortable, shifted positions more than usual, let out a small sound that wasn't pain exactly, just effort. I sat on the floor beside him without thinking, not touching, just there. And for the first time I let myself imagine the house without his breathing in it. The silence returned immediately in my mind, full, uninterrupted, the kind I thought I'd left behind, that scared me more than losing him. And that realization stopped me cold, because it meant the decision wasn't clean. It meant love and fear were tangled together in ways I didn't know how to separate. The next morning I called the clinic. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. I asked questions I already knew the answers to, clarified timelines, discussed comfort. We scheduled a date. Saying it out loud made it real. The days leading up to it were strangely gentle. I took time off work, sat with him more, let the routine stretch instead of rush. The walks were shorter, slower. I didn't mind. Nothing felt wasted anymore. The morning of the appointment, I woke up before the alarm. The house was quiet, not empty, just still. He looked at me the way he always did. No understanding of what the day held, no expectation. That felt like both a mercy and a burden. At the clinic, the room was dimmer than the others, softer, designed to hold grief without advertising it. She explained everything again. I listened, I nodded, and when the moment came, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't ready. Not in the way people mean when they say that. I was certain. Certain that waiting longer wouldn't make it easier. Certain that pretending this was only about him would be dishonest. Certain that loving something meant knowing when to let it go, even when it unraveled you. I stayed with him. I felt the room change again, but this time, it didn't collapse. It held. Afterward, the house was quiet in the old way. But I was different. The silence didn't swallow me. It sat beside me. And for the first time I understood that what he had given me wasn't rescue, it was presence, and that presence didn't disappear with him, it stayed. The days after were slower than I expected, not heavier, not empty in the way I remembered from before, just slower. The house sounded different. Not silent, just altered. Like a familiar song played in another key. I noticed it most in the mornings when I woke up and didn't immediately know what time it was. There was no urgency. No body waiting for the day to begin. I stayed in bed longer than usual, listening to the house settle into itself. Pipes, distant traffic, the faint hum of electricity behind the walls. The quiet didn't rush at me. It waited. I moved through the rooms carefully at first, as if they might react to me differently now. Some habits lingered. I still glanced at the spot by the window. Still reached for the leash without thinking. Those moments didn't hurt the way I thought they would. They felt respectful, like the mind making sure something important wasn't lost too quickly. I didn't clean his things right away. Not because I couldn't, because I didn't need to. The bed stayed where it was. The bowls stayed by the wall. They weren't reminders, they were evidence, proof that something real had happened here. Friends checked in again, asked how I was doing. This time I had words, not polished ones, not comforting ones, just honest ones. I said I was okay, and I meant it. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't broken. I was intact. The routines shifted instead of disappearing. I still woke up early even without a reason, still went for walks, sometimes along the same route, sometimes not. The pace was different now, faster, less deliberate. I noticed that. I noticed how quickly I moved when I didn't have to slow down for someone else. That awareness stayed with me. The house didn't feel full again, but it didn't feel hollow either. It felt like a place that had been lived in deeply and was now resting. Some evenings I sat in the same chair and let the quiet arrive on its own terms. I didn't turn on the TV right away. I didn't fill the space just to prove I could. I listened. And what surprised me was how much of myself I could still hear. Not the anxious noise from before, not the flat neutrality, something steadier. I realized then that the worst part of the collapse hadn't been the loneliness. It had been the way I had disappeared from my own life. Caring for him hadn't fixed that in a dramatic way. It had just given me a place to stand while I remembered how to show up. I understood something else too. Something uncomfortable but necessary. I hadn't saved him. Not in the heroic way people like to imagine, and he hadn't saved me either. What we did was quieter than that. We noticed each other. We moved at the same pace for a while. We kept time together when time had stopped making sense. That was enough. Weeks passed, then more. The sharp edges softened, not because they were ignored, but because they were allowed to exist without explanation. I stopped measuring days by what was missing. I started measuring them by what was present. Some days that was very little, and that was okay. One afternoon, standing by the window, I caught my reflection again, the same place I had barely recognized myself before. This time I didn't look paused. I looked located, like someone who knew where he was, even if he didn't know what came next. I didn't rush to fill the space he left. I didn't need to prove anything. I let the house remain honest. Eventually, I packed away his things, slowly, carefully, not as an ending, but as a continuation. They didn't disappear. They became part of the story. And when people ask me now what that time meant, I don't reach for a neat answer. I don't say it changed my life. I say it returned me to it. My name is Michael. I'm 37 years old, and for the first time in a long while, I know how to stay present in my own life. That's what he gave me, and that's why I'm still here, telling this story.